So welcome to Thursday morning session. We're on Unit 7. So we're going to act differently in this one. I'm not going to actually put interactive questions in the form, but it's going to be a fairly long video because I'm going to go through it in a little more detail. And then all you have to do in the morning really is use the PowerPoint to either explore a reading if you want or watch some of the videos if you want. But I know you're busy with the presentation, so it's really an overview just to close off the overviews that we've done on the different categories. We're going to look at three different things. First, an example of psychosocial theoretical framework, then an example of psychodynamic theories, and then we're going to discuss grounded theory because we've discussed this already. Okay, if we go here, remember this is grounded theory is this inductive piece, so completely separate. But because it talks about theory, we need to just situate it to and talk to you about how to categorize or classify a grounded theory if you encounter one. So that's what we're doing today. So psychosocial theories, what are they? So they are considering the individual now no longer in terms of brain development or childhood development, but really always seeing the individual in a social canvas, in a social a network, in social interactions. So they don't negate other theories about brain development, but they just add this other social layer, and they focus more on that than on cognitive development itself. They tend to see these interactions and that social function as more important in the end than cognitive development. They sort of take it for granted that yes, obviously the brain develops and we have cognitive development and we learn, but that it's an entirely added value, if you want. That is that social interactions and what we gain from that interaction. There are many psychosocial theories and they become more and more important. So historically, as you've seen the sort of early psych theories being important to education in the 60s, 70s, now with history, we tend to find these psychosocial theories more relevant than the cognitive theories themselves. So they're very, very popular in educational research. So I'm going to give you one example. And it's social capital theory. You will actually have two examples. You have a colleague who's going to talk about ecological theory, and that would have fit in there. I was going to talk to you about ecological theory, but since it's been taken, I'm going to talk to you about social capital theory anyway, or instead, sorry. So social capital theory, I've spoken to you a little bit about it already. It argues that the individual's networks are as important as the knowledge that they gain through education. And that's why they call it capital, because they argue that actually these networks actually lead to gains that are just as quantifiable and just as important in terms of value for the individual as education and knowledge itself. Because they lead you, as I've written here, to opportunities, gains, financial gains, employment, revenue, functionality in society, well-being. All of these things these theories argue, a consequence of having a high or a well-developed social capital. And importantly, these schools have been late in recognizing social capital and social capital theory, but now schools are starting to realize that they have a role to play and that they must focus on supporting the learners. In which way? Well, in enriching these networks and on widening these networks. Because usually when you look at social capital theory, there are two dimensions of the networks that are relevant. It's not just about having networks, it's about having good networks. And the two dimensions that make these networks profitable and good and conducive to well-being are the width of the network, but that in itself isn't sufficient. It's the width and the richness. So if the network is wide but you can't rely on these people very much, then that's pointless. You need to have the width and the richness. So to get to know the people in the networks to a sufficient degree that they actually really are, you can count on them for access to certain things. There's a great little video. It's only about 4 or 5 minutes long. So if you want to pause and go and watch the video on the PowerPoint and come back, I think you're going to find it really, really useful to get this. So towards the end, it talks about technology. Obviously, social capital theories come back with a force since the days of the internet. And people now are very, very focused on social capital in some virtual spaces. But it existed before. So you can watch the whole video until the very end. And it's all about any social capital, not just in tech. But towards the end, you realize that the person making it is actually thinking mostly about tech. So how can we link it to wider theoretical paradigms? So it fits nicely with phenomenology, obviously, because these networks are really only exist in the person's perceptions. So they are extremely subjective. This is the perfect example of subjective construct of reality through lived experience. These networks not something necessarily tangible that pure science can look at. They exist within the mental construction, the psychological construction of the person that identifies these networks as being there. So it's very, very well aligned with phenomenology. So what kind of opportunities in education? Well, I talked to you already about some of my interests, but you see a lot of it now in the use of social networks in the classrooms. So how to ensure that these kids are connecting, making these contacts, establishing wide networks, that they feel affiliated with their classroom, that they feel affiliated with people of their age. Gaming is very important too, and to some extent outdoor education, because that social networking doesn't necessarily have to just happen in virtual spaces. So extracurricular education, outdoors education, all the things, and to an extent, regular sports and extracurriculars involve social network as well, and the enrichment and widening of social networks. So they can be very important as well. It's fascinating. Well, and fascinating is in its theory and area. And as I said to you, it is probably the biggest pillar of inclusion, because the reason why we have put in the 80s and 90s put an end to segregated school, it's because it was felt that kids that were educated in segregated schools, school for the blind, school for learning disabilities, were missing out on opportunities for social capital, and that this was really a quantifiable loss for them, that their social well-being and their social integration was limited by the fact that they were not able to actually develop the same networks as their peers, and that's why there's been this push to mainstreaming. You've got an example there of, as I said every time, a study. So I'll encourage you to read the abstract and just have a look at the example. And some resources as well that I will add to the readings in a section. Now we're going to talk about psychodynamic theory. So you've probably never encountered that word. It's not frequent in education for people to have encountered that word. So what does it mean? Well, dynamic talks about force, right? Force, momentum, vector. And psycho obviously is about the brain. So it's really this notion that we have forces in the brain that lead to have it, or at least that have an impact on the way we think and the way we act. But psychodynamic forces consider that momentum, that force, that vector is subconscious. It's not free will. It's not the decision making we do. It's not the regular brain development. It's things that exist in parallel and exist in a subconscious level. So they are having an impact on our thoughts. It's having an impact on our behavior and our actions, but we don't realize that it is. All of these theories have that in common. They were very, very popular in the 80s when there was a huge push for psychoanalysis in schools and education, particularly in Europe. In Europe, it's still quite popular, actually. But it's sort of dwindled down in terms of public and media appeal, but it's still quite common. You're actually going to find quite a lot of still a lot of studies that look at this. Now, it's been reframed, and to some extent now you see it appear in different forms under different label, like under trauma-informed education, for example. And we're going to see also that we can talk about transfers and counter-transference in education. I'll make a note of this. I'll come back to these two notions and explain them at the end. So on this example, I'm going to look at the most sort of classic Freud's notion of the subconscious. I've given you some websites that are going to give you the essence. I think this is easy to watch and to understand. I'm going to spend too long explaining to you about the ego and the id and how his hypothesis of the subconscious sort of functions. I think it's something that you should be able to squeeze in about half an hour and get the essence of this. The biggest takeaway is that really these various forces that he articulates and describes through a very meticulous process of having three sort of different forces. It's like a hierarchy of the subconscious, things that are on surface and then things that are deep in the subconscious, but end up having that impact that they shape some of our actions, some of our decisions, some of our words, and have an impact on the conscious level. So forces that come from the subconscious end up having an effect on our behavior in schools, for example, or in society. So have an impact on the conscious level, but then we don't understand them, and that's what creates confusion. And that's what create confusion for teachers, for example, or for people that surround the person that is motivated by these subconscious forms. In terms of research design, so they actually would work well with qualitative methodologies, you would think, right? Because you could think psychoanalysis, the arts, people expressing themselves. But what we're seeing is actually a lot of these theories present themselves as hard, sort of pure science, right? They're really trying to be very positivist, and a lot of them will actually do a lot of quantitative and mixed methods, trying to show the principles that they advocate for as being valid, transferable, affecting everyone. So a lot of the studies actually oddly position themselves from very quantitative and mixed method, sort of because again they are trying to position psychoanalysis as a science, and trying to say that the principles that are sort of presented are valid and transferable, which is questioned. Um, And yes, so I talked about the methodology already, and in terms of theoretical landscape, well, as I just said, it really tries to be fairly grounded in positivism, although it is criticized. But certainly in the 80s when it was big, it was really put forward as that's why psychoanalysis was almost like into the doctors. It's really about treatment, and it's about being affected by these principles that are sort of recognized by under that theory and valid across populations and can be recognized in anyone that is affected by them. So a very positive approach to the whole process, which again is challenged by other theorists in other fields. So you've got an example there. Nurture groups in the UK. There's a lot of psychodynamic use of nurture groups, and I'll let you explore it if you're interested in that. We see less of them in Canada, but very big in the UK, and that definitely is underpinned by psychodynamic theory as a canvas for that. And you've got a few references that I'm going to link to the library in case you are interested. So I talked to you when we started saying that the revival of psychodynamic is no longer it's less Freudian. There's also been Lacan theory, right? From Lacan was, I think he's Swiss, another psychoanalyst that wrote an awful lot. But now it's mostly, we've lost kind of the psychoanalysis aspect, but we still talk about psychodynamic in different ways. And now it's come back in the form of trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care has been around now for about 10 years, very big in social work in indigenous communities, because it sort of enables counselors to understand and acknowledge that transgenerational trauma can have an impact on the people that they are supporting, and that sometimes the reaction and the manifestations of what they're seeing has nothing to do with what's going on, but is generated by something which is subconscious, and they argue transgenerational as a result from the residential schools and sort of the trauma that's been imposed on, so that indigenous communities have been subjected to. It's widened. It's used in the LGBTQ community as well, in terms of trauma of coming out, and then of explaining why people can have certain manifestations, psychological manifestations that are not proportionate to any cause in the immediate sort of vicinity or in terms of time. Someone might break down. You don't understand why they break down, and so then this trauma-informed care comes in and said, actually, it may be that there's been a trigger, and that is something that comes from way before. So in LGBTQ literature, often people say that the coming out trauma can manifest itself for many, many years in ways that people don't always understand, and that certainly the peers don't understand. And now it's entering education. So I have a colleague in Australia who is working in that field, and she is working in inclusion, but she's working from a trauma-informed perspective, and that's her theoretical lens. Transference and counter-transference I use quite a lot when I teach courses in inclusion. So it's again psychodynamic lens. It's borrowed directly from the field of counseling. And this is the two principles that counselors and therapists have used for many decades. There's a lot of literature in it, but it's actually in counseling, but it applies to the classroom. And certainly I feel it applies every day in the classroom, but we should talk about it more. And so transference and countertransference represent phenomena that therapists argue take place when a therapist receives a client. The client is likely to project onto the therapist emotions that have nothing to do with the therapist, that may be emotions that would normally have been targeted at someone else in their past or in their current background, but they shift these emotions and project them onto the therapist, either because of gender or because of age, but something triggers a sort of shift and the emotions get sort of projected onto the therapist. So therapists, notice this and observe it in their practice often, that there could be violence or aggression or fear or shame or sometimes the opposite, too much joy, too much attraction, but that these feelings cannot be understood by the therapist in the terms of time they've spent with the client or in light of the acts or the words that they've had with them. So they argue then that this is a pure shift from emotions that come from somewhere else and are directed at someone else that get projected onto the therapist. And that's what we call transference. But importantly, therapists and counselors also talk about countertransference. And they said that they observe the same thing, that they sometimes have emotions towards the clients that are not connected in a causal way by any events or words from the patient themselves. So they might get angry at a patient, they might get irritated at a patient, they might get too attached to a patient, and then have to recognize that these feelings have nothing to do with the patient themselves, but have to do with feelings that they have for someone else that have transferred onto the patient through a process of countertransference. This is very important because you can't, therapists and counselors argue that you can't avoid this. But what you can do is you can be conscious of it and you can try and reduce the impact that it has on your relationship with the client. We do this in the classroom. We do it an awful lot. And so transference and countertransference is really useful. I work in challenging behavior and I've used it a lot. Often you will see a child having challenging behavior, and it's definitely, typical example. I used to work in a school where I was one of the only male, two males for 40 women teachers, and the other one was a PE teacher. And I would get called down to a floor, and someone, a teacher would send a student up, say, "Could you come down?" And I would come down. I would say, this challenging behavior. Could you handle it? And I would take the kid aside and into the corridor, into another room. And often that's it. They would de-escalate. The kid would return to class at the end of the period. And the teacher would say, "Oh, thank you so much." And I'd have to say, "Well, actually, I didn't do anything at all." Sometimes just the fact that you're male, when there's, something that is definitely, you can see it, that targeted at mother figures, and the teacher react in a certain way, and then you're getting that whole emotion that has nothing to do with what happened in class, but something that maybe have happened in the morning or is happening at home. But you, just by stepping in it, by being male, stops that process of transference and then creates calm and a return to normal. So it's very, very noticeable. But we do it as well. So as teachers, you will be irritated by someone, and that's the process of countertransference. Sometimes it has nothing to do with that child. Um, I remember when I went to, before I joined McGill, I went to McGill for a workshop when I was still working in schools, and it was a workshop on transference and countertransference. And he made us sit at this big sort of round table in the workshop, and he made us leave a space between each other. And then he said, "Imagine that kid that triggers you. Imagine them there the whole day, and you're going to be talking to them as you do the workshop." I did tell you it works really well. He made us go to the bottom of your emotions and why they're triggering you. And it has nothing to do with the kid. It definitely has to do with countertransference. Things that irritate you in other people, you're suddenly transferring to that kid because you've been triggered in projecting or you recognize something. And that's really unfair. So you really have to get into control of that, because that's how situations escalate. And the worst thing is that often the student actually has not created that escalation. It's just that you're projecting your emotions, and those emotions are not originating there, they're originating somewhere else. So if you're interested in transference and countertransference, there's literature, but go and get it into the counseling field. You're going to find it easily in libraries and on Google. And it's definitely something I encourage you to look at. It's one of the ways that psychodynamic theories can still be very useful in teaching. So they're still there. And we don't talk about them as much, but they're still there, and there's still quite a lot of resources and lots of occasions where you'll be able to just take a psychodynamic theory out of the drawer and reapply it to something you're doing. It's still quite common. And lastly, this is less relevant, but I want to talk to you a little bit about grounded theory. We've talked about grounded theory. Remember, it's that's on the side of the slide that with this visual representation. It's that inductive process, so the reverse of everything that we've seen. That little minority of articles that doesn't work in a deductive way. It doesn't start from theory, starts from data and works up to theory. That's called grounded theory. As we've explained, grounded theory is not a theory; it's a methodology. But I still want to talk to you a little bit about it, because you've got to figure out what you do with that grounded theory once it emerges, right? How do you classify it? How do you categorize it? So first, you've got a short video there that explains what grounded theory is. And its process is very arduous. I mean, you may have looked at this in 6110. Normally, that's when we look at grounded theory because it's a methodology. It's a very arduous process. It's a process where you reject all of your assumptions in terms of theory till you let the data speak. And that seems easy, but it's not easy. See, all the steps that I described there, open coding, actual coding, selecting coding, memory, these are all repetitive steps that you take. And every time you seem to have some categories in the data, you reject them because you think, I can still see myself. I can still see my theoretical assumptions here. So I reject them and I try again. And you do that over and over and over again till you reach something that actually speaks to you in a way that you would not have understood. And that's the test to saying, okay, now it's really the data speaking. I've actually been able to do a clean slate and actually reject all of the theoretical lenses I have to actually see this data in a way that is purely sort of neutral. So I'm not going to talk too much about it because it's really a methodological process. This is normally seen in 6110, but it is still important to think what happens then, right? When you get there. It's important to know, first of all, that there are two types of methodologies, theory of methodologies. Yes, grounded theory as a methodology. We have two traditions, the Glaswegian, Strass and Glaser invented it, and then they split. And so you will see two camps, and I will explain you to a little bit later how these two camps differ. But just so you know that within that methodology, there are two types. And it's important when we come to think about the emerging theory and what to do with it, because both these authors, which now have created two schools, think of that theory that emerges in a different way. Another person that's worth looking at is Katie Kalmaz. Katie Kalmaz is a nurse educator, prof in nursing, but she is one of the current most important voices in grounded theory. She does a lot of really great stuff. If you're interested in grounded theory, you've got a long YouTube video there. She's really great because she's a very posed, quiet, balanced speaker. So you can listen to her for a very long time, and she makes things very clear, although it's very complicated. She has this way of really a natural teacher. She makes things sound very, very easy. So when you have time, and that might be after the course, I encourage you to look at Katie Kalmaz's video and to read some of her stuff. It's actually very fun to read. You've got an example of grounded theory there. Always important to give you an illustration so you see it in practice. You've got two actually. And that's what I want to finish off with, the difference between Straussian and Glaswegian. So again, it's got to do with Strauss and Glaser and the different ways that they are looking at grounded theory. So for Strauss, I say here, once the theory emerges, the process becomes deductive. So that's the main difference, right? You start with the data and you get to categories, and then eventually you get to a theory that appears, it emerges. For Strauss, he argues that once you're there, there's no reason to remain in an inductive process. You have the theory, so now you can work backwards. You can actually work in a deductive way. So it's inductive to start with, and then it becomes deductive. He argues that as soon as you have a theory, well, then apply it like a theory. And then that leads you to a choice of methodology, and that's how you finish your study. You don't actually have to finish in a deductive way. You start in a deductive way. As soon as you have your theory, you continue in a traditional way, back to theory, choice of methodology, and you go back to the data and you apply it in a regular way. Glaser argues in a different way, and he says that really the process should remain continuously inductive until the theory has emerged, and that's it. And you stop there, and that's it. You have a new theory, and that is an emerging theory. So you might ask yourself, well, what do we do when it's emerged? Once it's emerged, you are going to have to situate it on the landscape. So usually when you read a grounded theory, it does pretty much what you're doing for your presentation. How does it relate to the four big ones? That's exactly what people do. So normally when it's a long process. So normally this would be a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, not just a journal article. So after you've done all these pages and all that study, and you've got your theory, it doesn't run just like a normal PhD where you would stop. You then take a whole chapter, a whole section saying, okay, I have a new theory. So how does it relate to other theory, particularly the four big ones that we've seen at the beginning of this course? So you would then say, this is emerging, this is completely new. And then you would position your grounded theory or emerging theory with respects to some of the compass points that we've given you. So you might say, oh, here's a new theory that I've emerged through a grounded theory process. And it's aligned with phenomenology, or it's aligned with postmodern thought, or it's aligned with critical theory. and you sort of you formulate it, you position it, and you show where it lies and how it's aligned to existing theory. Even if it's emerging, this is the important conclusion here. Even if it's emerging, it still automatically has to position itself in the landscape, and therefore is going to have relationships with existing theories. It's going to be new, but not so new that you can't align it with something. Okay, that's less important, so you should have enough with that. I'm not expecting you to go and look at any resources or anything, but I did want, before we finish the course, to just mention grounded theory, because sometimes I have my students say, but what about those, and what do we do with those? So that's it. They're new, they're out of the box, but you can still put them on the map, and you can still show what they are aligned to. So I will leave it there. That's enough for today. I think you have a long video already, and you'll all be preparing your presentations. So use the time for that, and I will see you at I can't remember what it is, but it's on the course schedule. I think it's 12:30 that we start for the first presentations. We'll see you tomorrow. So no recap session tomorrow. We're going straight into the presentation because there's no questions. I'm not opening forum discussion threads. I'm just saying, if you have time, go to the PowerPoint and watch those videos as a complement to complement my introduction to the theories. Okay, bye for now.